Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again. Today we're going to build the beginnings of a landing page or a home page, and it's going to look something like this. So if you're new to HTML or CSS and you're going through an online coding curriculum, such as the one at Free Code Camp, you'll likely be asked to build a landing page or a home page. And in fact, for Free Code Camp, as part of their responsive web design certification, you'll have to complete 5 responsive web design projects, and one of those is a product landing page. At the top of the project requirements page, you can see a link to an example of a landing page. And it looks nice and clean, well organized. You can even look at the code, the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript associated with it. And you can see that this landing page passes all of the tests that it should pass. And what those tests are looking for is given right here. So today what we're going to do is, like I said, just build the beginnings of a landing page. And this is a landing page or a home page for a fictitious online tech journal. A journal which I've given the cheesy name of SciTrekker. Right, and as you see, it has a nice nav bar at the top. It's got an interesting image with a welcome message overlaid upon it. And you can see that it's mobile responsive. If I shrink the page down, or if I try to mimic a mobile device, everything shrinks down nicely, and you can see that the nav bar itself, the links in the nav bar collapse into a drop-down menu. Right, so the first thing we want to do is add a nav bar to our home page. So we've got an HTML file here I'm calling HP1. Right, we'll give it a title of SciTrekker. We'll add a link to our CSS style sheet, which in this case we're calling style1.css. And we can look around and find plenty of examples on the web of how to make a nav bar, a responsive nav bar for your home page or landing page. So if we just type into Google responsive navigation bar, we see there's a link at the top to W3 School's example of how to create a responsive navigation bar that looks like this. And they give you the code. They start off with the HTML, so we can take that and paste it into our project. Also, we'll need a link to their style sheet. We'll put that in our CSS file. Sorry, no, we'll put that in our HTML file. In the head. So if we just look at how things are now, we've got nothing like what we were promised. Right, we want things to look this way. So we'll need to add some CSS, and this w3schools.com responsive navigation bar tutorial gives us that code right here. So if we take that and paste it into our style sheet file, and if we refresh our page, there you go. You've got the nav bar that you were promised, the one that looks like this. Okay, is it mobile responsive yet? Well, we can shrink down our screen, and all it does is it seems to excuse me, it seems to just cut our nav bar down by about 70%. Basically, it gives you about a third of what you had in the full page, or the full screen. So how can we make it mobile responsive? Well, W3 Schools gives us the code to do that as well. And we do it using media queries. So if we add that into our code, remember before it wasn't collapsing, but if we refresh the page now, it does collapse into this drop-down menu. But when I click on it, nothing happens. So there's just a little bit more that we have to add, and it's JavaScript. Alright, so we'll take this JavaScript and we'll add it to our HTML file. Alright, and we'll have to add script tags, or a script tag, and we'll put it in there. Alright, so before it wasn't giving us the drop down. If we refresh the page, now it does. Alright, so that's one example of how you can easily add a nav bar to your project. But I like to use Bootstrap. It makes things look a lot cleaner, and Bootstrap is meant for you to design with mobile devices in mind. You sort of give priority to mobile devices, so there's a lot of built-in responsiveness. So the first thing we'd like to do is get a Bootstrap Navbar. So we'll have a new file, a new HTML file, which we'll call HP2. We'll give it a title of SciTrekker Bootstrap. We'll link a style sheet to it. And this time we're going to use a style sheet called style2.css. Alright, now let's bring Bootstrap into our project. So if you type in your Google search or whatever search engine you use, get Bootstrap, you go to it and you click the Get Started link. You'll find the code necessary here for the CSS link, and we can put that in our HTML code. Right, but we're not done yet. We also need to bring in this JavaScript code. And we'll put that in the body just before the closing tag, the closing of the body tag. Okay, so now we're ready to go with Bootstrap. And we'd like to bring in this nav bar here. So if we type nav bar into the search, it brings us to the nav bar documentation page. And it gives you some examples of the different nav bars that you can quickly add to your project just by copying and pasting code. This one, for example, doesn't have a search field, but we'll bring in the one that does have a search field. This one here. So if we copy the code, paste it into our body, and we run it. Okay, we see we've got our nav bar here. First of all, we've got this disabled link that we really don't need. I don't want to keep this drop down, nor do I want to keep this link here. So we can take those out. Right, first we can remove the drop down. That's here. We can remove this disabled link. Alright, we can call this link about, and we can create another link for news. Then we can see how that looks. Alright, so we've got those links here that we wanted. We've also got the brand here. For example, our brand is SciTrekker. That's the name of our fictitious online journal. For Bootstrap Navbar, their brand is Nav Bar. So we can change that easily. We go up to here where it says Nav Bar brand. We change the text here to SciTrekker. Okay, and that works. But maybe we want a font that is a little bit more futuristic in keeping with our tech theme here. So what we can do is we can go to Google Fonts. And Google Fonts, I'm sure you're going to rely on this heavily in your web development career. Google Fonts has lots of nice fonts that you can incorporate into your pages to make them look a lot better. For this one, I found one earlier called Ubuntu. It's just slightly more futuristic than the text we had, so we can incorporate that into our page. So if I go to the style sheet that I'm using for my HP2 HTML file, you can see I've already got some code to import Google Fonts here. Alright, so all I need to do, if I want to bring in Ubuntu, the Ubuntu font, is put in a vertical bar and then type in Ubuntu. Okay, that's not all though. We need to make sure that this element here, this brand name, is the only thing that gets affected by our change. It's the only font that changes when we change our font. We don't want to apply it to the whole page. So if we look at the class of that text element, it's class navbar brand. So what we can do is go into our style sheet and create a selector for navbar brand. We can add the font family, Ubuntu. Okay, and if we run things, we see that it changes. It's not much different, but it's slightly more futuristic looking than the text that was the previous text was. And now, let's say we don't really like the background color of the nav bar. Just like our earlier example, we wanted to create a nav bar that had a dark background. So if we go to the nav bar documentation page and scroll down to a section called color schemes, you can see they've got 3 different nav bar examples here, and we see one with a dark color scheme. Let's use that one. So now our code has nav bar light and background light. All right, what we need to do, according to this documentation page, is change it to nav bar dark and background dark. So that's easy enough to do. Alright, there you go. So our nav bar looks the way that we want it to. So now, like our example, we want to add in an image right under the nav bar, this interesting image. Right, and I have it already included in the project here. This is the full image. Alright, so if we just go into our HTML and under our nav bar we add the image, right, if we just add things, if we just add it as it is now, what happens? Well, we bring in the image, but it's far too large for our screen. So we need to shrink it down, and we know we can do that with CSS by changing, say, the pixels, the width, using a pixel setting, like say 800 pixels or 1000 pixels, for example. We can do the same thing with the height. But Bootstrap has a way for us to quickly shrink the image down according to the viewport size, and that's nice. What we do is we just add a class, image fluid. Now image fluid is only going to work in Bootstrap version 4, right, and that's what we're using here. Right, if you're using version 3 or below, you would use image responsive. Right, but that's not going to work for us. So we use image fluid, and let's see what that does for us. Okay, it definitely shrunk the image down, and width-wise, everything's looking good. Again, we can look at the full image here, and we can see the full width is represented on our landing page. Now the vertical height, you'll have to do something to change that later. We're only doing the starting of a landing page here, so hopefully you can figure out a way to make this image work for you, or whatever image you use. But again, the power of image fluid in Bootstrap is quickly recognizable when we implement it. Alright, so now what we need is some welcome text. Alright, so we think that if we go into our HTML and we create a container, and let's just call it image container. You don't want to use just the container class, because that's a built-in Bootstrap class, and things might behave unexpectedly if you do. We'll of course bring in our image. And then we'll add a couple of header tags, right? An h1 with welcome to as its text, and an h2 header with the future as its text. And let's see how things look now. All right, well, we don't have any text where we want it to be, but we do have text on the page. It's just under the image. So what we would like to do is bring it up and have it here. That's where I'd like to put it. So let's first focus on the welcome to text. I'd like it to be, and I'd like the center of the text to be somewhere around here. Okay, so how can I do that? Well, in the CSS, I can create a selector that allows me to manipulate that element, but what element is it? It's the one that, there are two elements which we haven't given an ID or a class reference to. So let's give these IDs. Call this one simply welcome, and we'll call this one simply future. Great, now we can create some selectors in our CSS file. Right, the first one we called welcome. And the other one we called future. Right, so we can use the top and left properties to move elements around. So for example, I want the center of this element to be, well, if I want it to be here, I want it to be about a third of the way down from the top, and then maybe a fifth of the way over from the left. So what I can do is I can say top 30%, and I can say left a fifth, so 20%. All right, let's see what that does for us. Apparently nothing. So what's going on? If we take a look at the CSS position layout documentation given by W3 Schools, you can see that you can position elements using the top, left, bottom, and right properties. However, these properties will not work unless the position property is set first. So we haven't set a position property, right? And there are 5 different position values: static, relative, fixed, absolute, and sticky. The default property is static, but it doesn't affect top, bottom, left, and right. Or sorry, it's not a static. It says here static positioned elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left, and right properties. That's why we're not seeing any changes. So what we'll use is position absolute. This one here. All right, now if we check out how things look. All right, the future went up to the top. And that's not the one we wanted to bring up first. So it looks like I added my properties to the wrong one. So we'll put it here in welcome. All right, now let's try this again. Okay, there we go. So welcome did go up onto the image. It's overlaid upon the image. Unfortunately, the center of this H1 element is not where we wanted it to be. It's here, yet we wanted it to be over to the left of this W. The reason for that is because when we move elements using the top and left properties, it's relative to the top left corner of the element. Right, so when we move things over to the right, that's in the positive X direction. And when we move things down, that would be in the positive Y direction. We've got sort of an inverted X and Y coordinate system. So basically we wanted the center of this element to be moved over to the left about half of the width of the element. So what we can do is we can add a new property. And we can move it over to the left, the center over to the left, right, by half the width of the element. And if we just keep the vertical change at 0 for now, let's see what we have. Okay, so it moved it over. Excuse me. And it's about where we want it to be, but maybe we'd like it to be up a little bit. But at this point, how far up we need to move it really depends on the size of the font, and I don't want to leave the font at this size. You can see here our font is much larger. So the font size that I want to use for this element is 70 pixels. Right, so let's see how that looks. Okay, so now I can see that maybe I want this element to be up a little bit higher, even just half the width of half the height of the element. So what I can do is change this to -50. Positive 50 would move it down, -50 will move it up. Okay, so now it's in a better position. We like it there. The font itself is kind of basic. I liked the Ubuntu font that we used up here, so I'd like to apply it to this text as well. So that's easy enough. Just make sure the font family selected here is Ubuntu. And there you go. All right, now let's bring up the future element. So already we know that the font size is going to be too small, so let's increase the font size of it first. And we'll make it smaller than the welcome to text, so we'll make it 50px. Okay, but we also want to bring it up. So we'll use the same position value, absolute. Right, but we don't want to use top 30% and left 20% because if we do, they're going to be right on top of each other. And we're also going to make sure that we're dealing with the center of the element. So we'll bring that here. And since the welcome to text is 30% of the way down from the top. Let's go 35% for the future. And since we want it to be offset and to the right, let's go 30% to the left, from the left. And see how that looks. Okay, so not quite there yet. We should probably move, we definitely need to move this text here down a little bit. Now, what if we move it down, say 10%? So instead of 35, we go 45. Okay, and maybe if you're like me, you're a little bit nitpicky, it's a little bit too far away. So let's make it not 45, but 43% and work our way closer. Actually, I like that. I don't mind it at all. But again, the text is too plain. I'd like to use something a little bit more futuristic. And I want the text to be different than the Ubuntu text up here. Slightly different, not a whole lot. So if we go back to Google Font, there's a font, and I may not find it quickly, so if I don't, I'll just go ahead and tell you what it is. And yeah, I think, oh, here it is. Able. I like this font. So I go up to the top, I add another vertical bar, and I type in Able, and I make the font family for future Able. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I like that. I like the slim font here and the slightly fatter, not slightly, but significantly fatter font up here. I like the contrast. You may not, and you can do things your way. It's certainly up to you. And the black color font is fine. It matches up with certain elements of this design. But there's also white here. Let's see what happens if we change the font color to white. And we do that for all of the text. Okay, that's not bad either. It certainly works well with this design. But I'd like it to have a little bit more pop, so I can add some text shadow to it. And you can play around with the settings for text shadow. See if there's something you like better. And we'll give it a red shadow. Let's see how that looks. Okay, I like it. All right, things are looking much better now. So here on our example page, and you see that we're fairly close to it, things are slightly different. All right, but here on this page, I have this dynamic thing where the welcome to text drops in from the top and the future text slides in from the left. All right, that makes our page a little bit more interesting. So how do we make that happen? Well, if you look in our style sheets, I've already included this text that refers to keyframes. And what these do is these allow you to animate your page so that your text can move around or other elements can move around. So the way that I'm going to use this keyframe called myMove in the the welcome to text element to give it a vertical shift from top to bottom, or not to bottom, to 30% of the way down, its resting position. Alright, I'll just add in a little code here. Right, and since I already have that code elsewhere, I'll bring it in. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing for future. In that case, excuse me, the title was, or the name of the keyframe was left to right. Alright, so what's happening here is it says animation left to right, so as you could guess, it's moving from the left to the right. It's happening over a 2-second time span, and it's easing it into a resting position. Right? So where it starts from is way off screen to the left, and then it ends up to where it originally was. And then for the welcome element, it comes in from the top of the screen, and it rests, or it comes to rest at 1/3 of the way down. Okay, so let's see how it looks. Alright, so it drops in, slides in. Alright, and that looks good. Except you may have noticed that the welcome to drops in over the nav bar. Also, you may have noticed that when we scroll, the nav bar disappears. Now, I don't like my nav bars to disappear. I want these links always available to the user so that they can quickly click away if they want to some part of the page that seems interesting to them. So let's fix this nav bar into place, and that's easily done. Alright, so we have a nav bar class, so we can just create a selector called navbar. .navbar. Alright, and we'll make sure that it takes up the whole width of the page. And we'll give it a position of fixed. Okay, so now what happens? Well, the welcome to still slides in over the nav bar, but if we scroll, at least the image underneath the text, slides under the nav bar. So we're almost there. So what we'd like to do is just raise this nav bar up a little bit so that the text also slides under it. And we do that by giving it a z-index of 1. Okay, so now it drops in under the nav bar and it scrolls under the nav bar. Alright, so we're almost there. Now let's check for a mobile responsiveness. If I shrink things down, well, the nav bar is good, and that's because Bootstrap takes care of that. It collapses those links into this drop-down menu. So we're good on that front, but unfortunately our image is shrunk down because of this class here, image fluid. That makes sure that even on mobile devices our image fits the screen. But our text isn't quite on the screen. We'd like to do something when the screen is small, under a certain pixel width, that makes all of this text appear on the screen in a way that we like. And so how do we do that? We use media queries. So if we go into our CSS style sheet, right, we can add a media query. And we'll say that for anything under 680 pixels, we'll say max width 680 px. And then we'll say, what are we going to do here? We want our text to shrink a little bit. So if our welcome to text was 70 pixels, we should shrink it down to, let's say 40. That's just a good start. All right, and our future text was 50, so let's shrink it down to 30. And how are we looking? All right, so nothing changes on the full-size screen. We shrink it down. Well, the text is fitting in a little bit better. All right, maybe I would like, well, at first we certainly need the welcome to text to fit in a little bit more, so we'll have to make the font a little bit smaller. So let's make it 35. Or let's just make it 30, see what happens. We don't want them to be the same size, so we'll make this 20. All right, so how does it look? Okay, so the font fits on the screen, but this future element is still, it's too far away from the welcome to text. We'd like to move it up. All right, so it turns out that I calculated the sweet spot, and it's about 38% from the top. So if I go into our media query, and I set the top property to be 38%, that's much better. So as you can see, we've got the beginnings of a nice landing page. It's got some interesting qualities, right? It's mobile responsive. So I hope this little tutorial helped you to get started on building a landing page or a home page if you're new to CSS or HTML. And don't forget the power of Bootstrap. It can help you out a lot, especially when adding a nav bar and image responsiveness to your project. So thank you very much for checking me out this time, and I hope to see you again soon.